Gore Vidal, at 75, is a towering figure in American letters, an essayist of genius, author of revolutionary novels as well as of the most ambitious historical fictions of the century. He has also been a scriptwriter, a TV playwright, commentator, critic, and general all-round scourge of the American empire. I met with him to talk about his work and his latest novel, The Golden Age. Gore Vidal is a novelist, playwright, screenwriter, essayist, but also, and maybe at the heart of all this, a prodigious reader.
I seem to have spent my entire life reading books, hence my eyes, which are today like infected buttonholes. Don't look too closely at them, viewers. I have a mild eye infection, but I started reading so early because I had a blind grandfather. And he used to chuckle sardonically, and he said, as I started reading to him 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and all day, and he said, you know, John Milton's had 2 daughters. They both went blind reading to him. He would chuckle as he wore one child or grandchild out after another. Except I enjoyed it, and he was my education.
And you used to read aloud to him. It strikes me over and over again that so many of your sentences just read as if written for the spoken voice.
Well,
is that conscious or is it just part
I
of
don't know. It's probably unconscious, but I hear it as I write it. I am oral in the A-U-R-A-L sense, and I do indeed hear prose as I write it down. I mean, I asked Lenny Bernstein once. I love other people's expertise where I know nothing at all. And music, I said, do you hear it? He said, no, you idiot, I see it. I said, what do you see? He said, I see numbers. Numbers? Yes. Pythagoras, you know. Notes, I see notes. Looking at me as though I was a village idiot. Well, I write a sentence and I hear it as it proceeds across the page. It makes a noise in my head.
Do you have a sense there's a slot into which it falls, the way a poet might have?
Yes, and in the long run, it is really the prose that matters. I mean, narrative is a sort of gift. The arrangement, however, how you put the music to your libretto, which is the language, that's charismatic.
Well, you had a charismatic debut as a writer. You were, what, 21 when Willy Waw came out, immediately after the Second World War.
And hardly a beautiful work of music, but I knew immediately what not to do. I didn't know very much of what I should do or
That's
could
90% of the battle, isn't it?
Well, when you're starting out, it's a good idea not to give too many hostages to fortune.
Well, you certainly gave a substantial hostage to the critics 2 years later when The Pillar and the Fire came out.
The City and the Pillar came out
Where did I get
in
that?
1948. I like your title better, though, than mine.
I'm a constant revisionist.
I know, and I like to rewrite, so perhaps I'll change it. It came out, it was my 3rd book, and I was 21 when I finished it. And it caused great distress. I had begun with a war novel, and was much admired because I was the first war novelist in point of chronology. And then I come out with this tale of 2 normal young men who have an affair. And one wanders off, and gets married, and leads a different sort of life. And the other one it's the romantic agony. The other one is hung up on his memory of it. And it's really a study of the romantic temperament, someone who finds something, tries to recreate it, can't recreate it, wants to find the original person, with some difficulty does, and it all goes wrong. Instead, people, of course, took it as just a disgusting, horrible story, banned in Ireland. Many bishops spoke against it. Banned in Australia, not translated into many languages until the last 10, 20 years. But it has never been out of print in English, and it goes on and on. Now it's so mild you can't see what it was that caused the distress. I think it was the fact that I regard, after all, I'd spent 3 years in the Army in the war, and there were 13 million of us in the American Armed Services, and one discovered a great deal about real life, and real life does not conform to what it ought to. Meanwhile, a fellow toiler in the field, as he once referred to me, Dr. Alfred M. Kinsey, 1 month after The City and the Pillar came out in 1948, he published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And the New York Times hated that book as much as mine. He got terrible reviews, was enormously successful, and wrote me a lovely letter complimenting me for my work in the field. So I felt as though I were a biologist. And with those two books, it was a kind of an earthquake, at least in the United States, that people began to revise their ideas of what is normality. And if there was such a thing, was it a good thing? Or is it, his theory, which is mine, is that sex is a continuum. There is this at some age, there's that at another, there is nothing quite a lot of the time. It's not a way to identify people.
Nothing, of course, is what nobody will write about.
Nothing is...
Every novel these days has to be jammed full of high-octane sex. Or
oh, I know.
Or the author is worried people might think the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think the wrong thing. Well, it was my father who once said, you know, about the Kinsey Report, all this, how many men are doing this, how many men are doing that, my father said, and there's an awful lot of nothing going on, I can tell you.
You were kind of, in a way, almost blacklisted. There was a conspiracy of silence about the book, wasn't there? I mean, did you feel
it wasn't much of a conspiracy, it was quite open.
Well, I was thinking just breathing together, everybody took a deep breath and decided to forget about you for a while.
Well, they did. The New York Times always is in the lead when it comes to malice. I mean, it's such a dreadful paper. Murray Kempton was one of our best journalists, and he said with the New York Times, he said, it's a paper that pretends to be above the battle, but then when the battle is over, it slithers onto the field and shoots the wounded. Well, it's that kind of paper, and their daily book critic, Orville Prescott, told my publisher, I will never read, much less review, a book by Gore Vidal. That was in 1948. 8 of my novels came out afterwards. No review in the New York Times daily, and none in Time, none in Newsweek, and that was total blackout. It's never happened to another novelist. Then I went away for 10 years and did movies.
And television.
Television.
You were effectively you were in at the birth of television.
At the birth of
as
television
a
drama.
What was that like?
Wonderful. You were doing something people wanted. If you write a play now or a novel, you're doing something that you may want, but it's you're not guaranteed anybody else is going to want it. It's a hard sell. When you write plays for live television, there were 7 live-hour plays a week out of New York. This means live actors were doing it, and it was being telecast simultaneously. Nothing was on film. Well, we had the most extraordinary audiences. It'd be 30, 40 million people would watch. You'd walk down the street the next day after one of your plays had been aired, and people would be talking about it on the streets of New York.
And it wasn't that there was a lack of other things to talk about. There was a magic element to that, wasn't there?
Well, it united the country, and it was for the first time I had an inkling of what the Theatre of Dionysus might have been like, what the Globe Theatre might have been like, when you had smaller communities and everybody participated in theatrical life, say. Everybody wanted to see the latest play. Suddenly, there we were in everybody's house. And as luck would have it, there were only about 6 or 7 of us who could take the stress. You were given only 1 week from the moment you sat around a table with the cast and the director to read the play. You had 7 days in which to rehearse, and on the 7th day, it went out live to the country, and you would be in a state of nerve. Is the actor going to remember his lines? Sometimes they didn't. Everybody watches. You can't make a mistake. It was nerve-wracking, but very exciting. And then to know that the whole country was watching, and that they were fascinated by these plays. And that was the only experience in my life I've had. Books that have been successful with the public and movies and so on. It was the only time in which I felt I was doing something that everybody was connected to. Everybody was watching these things.
It was a kind of communion, wasn't it?
It's very nice, if this is your business, literature, and your art as well, that you know that you have a connection. There's a kinetic energy going between what you've done and an audience. who sits and listens and watches. I've never had that feeling again. Novel writing, as we know, is a solitary thing.
Did you fear that you mightn't get back to fiction? Was it a very seductive world? And I don't suppose writing the script for Ben-Hur was going to deflect you from your muse. But
No.
though you did have a bit of fun at Charlton Heston's expense.
Well, I regarded movie writing as that was for money. I would have done television playwriting for nothing, just for the excitement of having it go out and having the people watch. And we had a wide range of subjects we could do. We had a lot of censorship. Ben-Hur was a means of getting out of a contract with MGM. So I said I would go to Rome. I'd give them 1 month. I would rewrite as much as I could and leave. And I left my mark on that film and then got out of the movie business and went back to novel writing.
When the novels started to flow again, did you miss that audience? The reason I ask is that of all the great American writers of the century, you've never had any fear that being popular could somehow mean you weren't serious. You get the sense a lot of people are afraid of writing popular books.
Well, they're not in much danger, are they?
I'd make a good straight man at dawns.
I think that I have, as you might guess from my career, if you've just even thought about the general outline of it, I've never had the slightest interest in other people's opinion of me. If I were popular, I was popular and duly grateful to the public that wants to read me. If they don't, I don't blame them, and I also don't blame myself. We're not connecting, that's all, and that can happen.
The two main strands, well, let's say two principal strands in your writing have been the essay and the novel. And it seems to me that both strands twist together to make a kind of a dissection of the American ruling class. That was the great secret in your youth, wasn't it, that there was a ruling class?
Oh yes, it's still a secret. I mean, the people are not in on it. Although I notice that my young cousin has now brought up something which I always do when I speak, about how the country is owned by 1%. They have all the wealth. And 20% do very well because they work for the 1%, and 80% of our people are doing very badly. They are not well off. Most of them are middle class who are falling back. So instead, most novelists, to the extent I looked around me very much at what other people are doing, they seem to write about victims from the point of view of a victim, presumably for other victims to read. I thought it might be more interesting and even instructive to write about the victimizers, since I know them a lot better than I know the victims.
Do they hate you for that, do you think?
Oh, I have no idea. I never asked.
And you've not sensed that?
Well, they sense, I remember Mailer saying once, he said, you know, I had to be a writer, says Norman. You didn't, in order to rise. And I said, well, I knew what he meant, but I didn't follow it.
Because, I mean, you know, your grandfather, Senator Thomas P. Gore, more or less invented Oklahoma.
Yes,
You
indeed.
shared a stepfather with Jackie Kennedy. You were born in West Point. Your father was a great hero of aeronautics and taught at West Point. So you were, in effect, born into that class, or certainly into that milieu. And then you go and blow the whistle on it.
Yes. Well, you know, no revolution ever started at the bottom. Spartacus is the rule down there. At the top, it's Julius Caesar. It's the disaffected member of the ruling class who can sometimes be useful. I'm not talking about becoming a dictator. I'm just talking about becoming relevant and interesting. He has a greater view, and if he has any sense of honesty, justice, proportion, he'll turn the lights on the world that he knows, which is what I've done in many books and many essays, and constantly try to make sense out of how it is that we ended up after 2 centuries with a global nuclear empire and no plan, which is where we are today. So this fascinates me, and of course my subject.
Is this American ruling class losing its grip? I mean, now that the corporations which have grown out of the great family empires have become transnational, I mean, at least they had however perverted, a sense of involvement with the business of America. Have they become disenfranchised even from that?
No, the ruling class is very much in place. And it's very hard to join. The 20% you can join. The president is one of the 20%.
You can become one of the eunuchs.
Yeah, well, androids, I like to think of them. And no, the ruling class is still WASP. It's still in charge. Every now and then somebody decides that this group or that group is too powerful. It's really always the WASPs. Every bank is owned by somebody with a name like Rockefeller or Mellon or
Bush.
Whitney. Not
Indeed.
Bush. He's 20%. He's
Is
not
he at
1%.
I'm missing
Bottom
something
of the
else this year.
20%, may I say.
You shy away, in all of your novels, you shy away from the confessional. You speak very directly about yourself as a man with a point of view. You have walk-on parts in your own fictions, but you shy away from that great American mid-century confessional mode. You know, there are no advertisements for myself in your books. Is that an aesthetic choice or just an instinctive thing?
I don't know. I think it's a form of manners. I was brought up that you didn't bore people with your private life. If I were a romantic novelist, I would, of course, have to break those rules, and I would have to write about what happened last summer at Ann Arbor, Michigan, when the character who's standing in for me did not get tenure, and his wife, Deirdre, went off with another woman, and a tale of, you know, real passion. But I don't aspire to such heights.
But what made you such a Roman, then?
Rome.
The virtues, the civic virtues you speak of are very like your theories of aesthetics. They're classical and they are Roman.
Well,
they're Enlightenment, but they're also Roman.
Our republic is Roman by design, from the capital to the Senate, which the capital houses. If you're brought up in Washington, D.C., surrounded by all this theme park, Roman theme park all about you, you know, right down Pennsylvania Avenue, there's a small river which has been paved over years ago. And it was already called, when we came to make the city in 1800, by the River Tiber. I mean, just everything worked out for the analogy.
Well, that struck
I
me.
don't work the analogy, nor do I think that we were the Roman Empire and now we're at the stage in which Tiberius is about to enter. History does not repeat itself. But the Roman Republic was indeed a model for the early American Republic. Both were based on slavery. We had many, many good things we took from Rome.
Let's talk about the 60s when Gore Vidal becomes the author. So again, here we are, more trouble. Myra Breckinridge, big storm. Then Duluth. And then, even though I know it's 90s, but I want to bring it back to here, the Smithsonian Institution. 3 novels that upset the Academy dreadfully. They completely rewrote the script. They weren't about middle-class people having angst about tenure or whatever was a metaphor for tenure. And Myra Breckinridge was very transgressive in its time, and I think possibly deliberately intended to be transgressive because it's the transgression in the story is backed up by all kinds of extraordinary pyrotechnics in the construction.
Well, I think that I do 2 sorts of novel. One is what I think of as reflections on history, in which case you might say there's a Roman cast to them. And the other are inventions like Myra Breckinridge and Duluth, in which I go all out for fictive inventions because they give me the most pleasure. I also don't know where I'm going when I place Abraham Lincoln at the center of a novel. I'm stuck with the fact that he goes to Ford's Theater that night.
Right.
Well, if I put him in Smithsonian Institution, I get him out of Ford's Theater and that, because that's an invention.
You also abolished a considerable amount of other history in the meantime.
Oh,
It's as
yes,
if you're deconstructing yourself. Because Myra Breckinridge and Washington, D.C. came out within a year of each other, didn't they? 67 and 68.
First came Julian, then came Washington, D.C., then came Myra Breckinridge. And 3 quite unlike novels.
Julian struck me. Julian was a tour de force, I think, an extraordinary, but the only book in the 20th century that I would think of was in a similar vein was Count Belisarius, Robert Graves, and maybe the Claudius novels. But this absolute immersion in another time, in another place. It took you out of America with enormous vigor. And somebody you admired, for instance, Italo Calvino, whom you admired enormously. Was there a time when you thought, I've done with America, no more dissection of America, and going elsewhere? You're not tempted to free yourself?
Well, I go to themes, and I've always disliked Christianity and monotheism in all of its forms, which includes then Judaism and Islam. The three religions of the book, I think, were the greatest disaster ever to befall the West. And Julian, the apostate emperor, is a perfect protagonist, as he felt the same way, and tried to stop what his uncle Constantine had made the state religion. And he was a pluralist, and he didn't want to be dictated to by one God and one aspect of deity, when there are plainly so many, or there may be none, but whatever it is, there should not be just one. And Julian provided me with the exact right point of view. A lot of his work still survives, his writings. So I wrote Julian, and then with creation I went to the 5th century BC, which is where every idea we've ever had philosophically, ethically, was thought of. One man, had he lived to be 75, could have met, most unlikely, but he could have, Confucius, the Buddha, Socrates, Zoroaster, Mahavira, and I invented such character.
But I suppose my point is, you were out of America, but you turned back.
But America is in all that.
Yeah.
I mean, there is Judaism, there's Christianity, there's Islam, bubbling away in decadent form, but they're still going on, so why not go back to show the origins, what it was like at the very beginning, not Zen Buddhism, but the Buddha, as recorded by Ananda, who was his sort of right-hand man. And you get much purer Buddhism than you do this Japanese variation that the Beats took up in the 60s, which made no sense.
I mean, I'm just suddenly struck by an analogy between Gore Vidal and the Buddha, which is probably sacrilegious either to you or to the Buddha. I'm not sure to which, but
similar weight.
Turning, well, I don't know, but certainly a certain gravitas that unites the two, but also a turning again to the wheel of suffering, because you keep turning back to America, and America breaks your heart.
Well, I'm not so sure that the heart is really frangible, but it gives me energy. Sometimes negative energy, but it's sometimes affirmative energy.
In the Golden Age, I mean, he'd die rather than say so, but Peter Sanford is an American patriot in some sense, though you never allow him to define his America. What hurts him or what offends him by substitution creates a sense of what America might be. Caroline Sanford's have much the same.
Oh yes, they have clear ideas of where it went wrong and maybe why it went wrong. Both are affected by Henry Adams, who said of why he stopped being a historian. He said, I never cared what happened. I wanted to know why it happened. Couldn't find out, gave up history. Well, at the end of the Golden Age, Peter, in a way, is saying, if I really knew what happened, you don't have to worry about why. So I've just taken it another step from Henry Adams, who in the end felt that everything was the dynamo, everything was energy. And all human beings are atoms that have come together for a temporary position to make a design in the air. And then energy goes and they reassemble as something else. Each of us is made up of material from the Big Bang. And how we are reassembled as people gives some credence to the notion of reincarnation, though how you can be reincarnated and have no memory of a previous life has always beat me.
You said that in an interview once, didn't you? That you remember the time before you were born, it was very happy and very quiet.
I was making a joke, and that's always dangerous with interviewers.
You were being interviewed by a professor, I think.
Yes, I did.
Yes, that was a very cruel thing to do to the poor man.
Oh, well, cruelty is part of human life.
Yes. Caroline Sanford, when she dies in the Golden Age, she simply falls to the floor, and it's almost as if she falls through the floor. And though she's been deeply loved, you don't allow mourning for her. There's certainly no unseemly grief.
No.
Is that your attitude to death?
Well, it's simply...
Is grief unseemly?
It's a fact, somebody torn from you in mid-affair or in active life. Yes, of course, there's grief. Someone who has had a long and full life who is now being withdrawn by entropy, no, I don't see any mourning. she accomplished that while she lived.
What did you hope to achieve with this whole sweep of novels, Burr, Empire, and so on, up to the Golden Age? It's a picture of America from the Republic through the Empire to what you call the national security state. Do you have a hope that it will affect how people think? Will it shift the country? Will it shift some people who may shift the country?
Well, it affected the way I thought.
Uh-huh.
I write these books to find out things. I don't go in with a theory and then, you know, like people who paint by the color, you know, by the square filling in colors. I go in looking for something, and I go where the evidence leads me, and I start to find recurrent patterns and types. And one thing you realize very early, particularly the 18th century, but even today, what a small deck of cards the ruling class is. And they just constantly play over and over and over again. A number of things became clear to me writing these books. No, I wrote them for myself to find out. In the process, I tried to make them interesting enough so that other people might want to read them and find out too. And of course, I'm always titillated by all the lies that we live by. The Golden Age, I mean, you know, Franklin Roosevelt provokes Japan into attacking the United States. This is not my theory, this is history.
Yeah.
It can't be true. And the court historians who are in the schools and so on, it's not true. He never knew. In which case...
But it is true, isn't it?
Of course it's true.
And it won't be a scandal, will it? Nobody will really care. Look what Nixon got away with.
Well, Nixon finally, I must say, Nixon sort of committed suicide.
But they buried him as a revered statesman. Does anybody care, I suppose, is what
I don't suppose anybody does care. The moral sense is... But you see, we have no educational system. Why do you think I spent 30 years of my life writing 7 novels about the United States if we could teach history in our schools, public schools? We don't.
Can I be very unfair to you and quote you something you said in 1972? Of course, you might have been just making a joke then too, but you said, there is not one human problem that could not be solved if people would simply allow me to advise them.
I did not put it quite like that, but that you have paraphrased it nicely.
Well, I mean,
I'm making a
with
joke.
all due modesty, advise us.
I'm making a joke.
But nonetheless, advise us.
Well, if I were a European, I would get them out of NATO just tomorrow, and I'd get the CIA out of Europe, because it exists only to keep European Western governments from going to the left. April 1948, CIA saw to it that Togliatti in Italy, a communist, would not be in the government, causing great chaos ever since. We have meddled and meddled and meddled in every continent. We have looked for trouble, we have found trouble. Our policy has been perpetual war for perpetual peace. And it's insane, and it's expensive, and we're dangerous. Particularly if you happen to have an aspirin factory in the Sudan, and one of our missiles blows it up, and we don't even pay to clean up the mess.
Gore, it's been an immensely productive life so far, and a great joy to those of us who are your readers. How much of it has been worth it?
Are you making an offer?
How much of it
Am
has
I
been
to
worth
assess it?
Has it
economically
been worth it? Have you spent your life so far as you would wish to have spent?
Yes, I've done exactly what I wanted to do. No, I didn't want to write Ben-Hur, but occasionally along the way, I managed to have a great deal of fun out of ridiculous things that I've had to do to make a living. But that was all long ago. No, I lived exactly as I wanted to and wrote what I wanted to write. And I'd say I was very lucky.
Gore Vidal, thank you for being with us.